And I have chosen to slightly change the order of the questions. So I believe it makes most sense to start with the context going into this year, and then switch to the immediate impact of COVID, and then finish up with supply chain and longer run considerations.
So hello everyone. Many of you know me. I'm Stéphane. Heim. I work at Kyoto University, mostly on the Japanese auto industry. But today, since we have many speakers, at least Holger, Bungsche also will speak about Japan, I will give a more, let's say, overall picture of what's going on in East Asian automotive industry. First, as you know, these crises happened while we were in a time where the 10 years long growth of the automotive industry was at an end, reached an end, yeah? In 2019, in China, since mid 2018, we saw the decline of sales. So that is quite important to keep that in mind in my view. Then a first set of questions we would address is whether the new trends, those structural trends like the greening of the car fleets, like the shift of the global demand towards emerging countries or robotization and so on might impact, transform the industries or not. Those are very different aspects, The first aspect is, few things about the market specificities of the three countries. As you can see, here is basically how evolved were those trends over the last 5 years. As you can see, both in China, Japan and Korea, the decline happened already, as I told you, but there are specificities. The Japan is the blue curve. You see peak of sales at the end of the fiscal year in March, usually, which means that this year it was quite similar. For Korea, we had an increase of sales in March due to specific incentives. The consumption tax was lower to 1.5% from 5%, and several incentives also to car outlets and so on. While in China, we reached the so-called new normal period where, while we still have a very low motorization rate, roughly 130 cars per 1,000 inhabitants, still with many people thought there is room for development, but many policies in China, strong regulations to have a number plates in Shanghai, in Beijing, and so on, makes the market quite well regulated. So the development of the Chinese market is quite dependent on the, let's say, local and central governmental policies. Then let's see the second and third graph, please, Mike. Here we can see the year-over-year evolutions in China, Japan, and Korea from 2015 till 2020. And what is important to notice here is that first, Japan has quite a first issue following the 2011 earthquake. So until 2015, the market was quite, let's say, stagnant. And from that period on, the growth was pretty not as expected by the government. While Korea has one specificity, is that it's an export-led growth industry, which means that, and mostly they sell their cars, roughly 70% of their exports go to US and Europe, Western Europe, and perhaps 50 or 55% of the auto parts also, which means Korea is highly dependent on those markets. And in this time of coronavirus, the both markets, China and US, were quite strongly hit, which means that for Hyundai, this high dependence on its export model is quite a problem. It's similar for Nissan and Honda in Japan. Nissan, as you know pretty well, had a corporate governance problem for 1.5 years. We saw also that they had plenty of a loss, roughly 6.5 billion of loss in last fiscal year. Now they just announced a new midterm plan until 2023 in order to reduce the capacity from 20%. So this is, they enter the crisis with several problems. Honda also is very specific because it relies also highly on China, on the Chinese market and on the US market. They sell only those mini cars, these K cars specific to Japan in Japan, yeah? Which means that this crisis for them is quite problematic. So that's the overall evolution. Regarding the production, we can talk about that later on, especially the value chain when we talk about these specificities. So that's just the first picture of what happened recently. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. Next up is, get my notes. Holger.
First of all, Holger Bungsche, Kwansei Gakuin University in Japan. And I would like to add something to what has Stéphane already said. And this is, when looking at Japan and the economic development of Japan in the last, let's say, 30 years, well, we had the bubble economy bursting in the early 1990s. And from then on, the economy basically is stagnating. When looking, for instance, at the first slide, which I had sent you, we see that after 1990, production more or less is stagnant. Yes, this second slide, please. Yeah, okay. This one, yes. No, the one before. Yeah, so since 1990, domestic production is more or less stagnating. We see the influence of, for instance, Lehman shock. We see the influence then in 2011 of the earthquake. But domestic production, domestic export from Japan, as well as domestic production as well as exports are stagnating at about 10 million cars per year. So that's the one thing. So many people have talked about the lost 10 years, and they have talked about the lost 20 years, maybe already talking about the lost 30 years. But anyway, when each time we have such a kind of crisis, so I said before, the burst of the bubble, then the Lehman shocks, and the earthquake. What is interesting is that the industry is not affected equally, or not every player in the industry is affected equally. And usually, because of several reasons, Honda is doing quite well, Toyota is also doing quite well, while Nissan, Mazda, Subaru, also Mitsubishi were doing quite badly. Well, overall, the picture there. Now, when looking particularly at the question of how the trends are evolving, I would like to point to one issue in particular, and this is the demographic development of Japan. Japan is the country which is supposedly in the world the fastest aging society in the world. And so with this respect, regarding, for instance, employment, working in the auto industry, in the future, the problem won't be that to find people, that there are not people, not enough people for working in the industry. There are some projections that the Japanese population until this century will shrink to below half of which is now. So the the prospect for the domestic industry is not, well, there will be no growth in the future to come. On the other hand, with the aging society, we have, of course, also the companies have the pressure, for instance, to react to an ever older population. So well, cars with assistant driving things or autonomous driving will be quite a issue in the future. So I think then one other thing, the greening of the industry. I have also in my presentation, maybe we come at the end of this session to this slide, but Japan had, in reaction to the crisis, so the Lehman shock, implemented a policy for fostering next generation vehicles, for fostering new technologies. I think it's the, if you go to the slide, it's the one which crisis as a change. Yes, this one here. And then also the next slide. So the Japan shifted this its focus in reaction to the Lehman shock to fostering by tax exemption, by incentives to particularly foster hybrid cars, plug-in hybrid, electric cars, fuel cell, and clean diesels. And over the years, so since 2009, when looking at the sales, about almost half of the car sales are now equipped with this new technology. And so whether this crisis now, so the COVID crisis, will lead to another extension of this market, much will depend on also how the Japanese government will react, and whether they will implement maybe new incentives for people to shift to new cars, to ecological cars, to boost in this segment, growth in this segment. Otherwise, the Japanese car market so far is just a replacement car market. Okay, I think that's some of the points in addition to Stéphane, and that's enough from my side for the moment.
Bruno, are you going next then?
Yes, please.
Okay, and then William, if you can be cleanup.
Okay, so good morning or good evening or good afternoon, depending on where you are, but I'm happy to see and to hear you. I would like to try to tackle the question. In fact, it's difficult to really separate the previous trends and now the impact of the COVID-19, but I will try to avoid talking too much about the COVID-19. And I would like to remind you what are for me, or what were for me the main structural trends and issues that the automobile industry was facing before the pandemic. And of course, it has been said before, so I don't want to develop these aspects, that China was decelerating for reasons that are specific to the Chinese economy, but also because most of the reasons that made China the first and the largest automobile market were getting to an end. For instance, it was becoming a replacement market and not a first equipment market, and many other features that we know in other mature economies were starting to really determine the evolution of the Chinese market. But on top of this, we had the end of the business cycle in the USA and also in Europe. So the automobile market was entering a downturn before the pandemic. And I think that the main impact of the pandemic will make the downturn much worse than what it could have been. So that's the first thing I would like to say. But it does not affect other trends such as demographics. China is an aging country. And many Asian countries like Japan have also a population which is declining. This is not the case of all Asian countries, of course, but this is not also the case of the US population, which is still growing and where the average age is younger than in Europe. So all these structural trends, I think, are not affected by the pandemic, but there is one for me which is important, which will really determine the evolution of the automobile industry. It is the energy transition of the automobile industry and the transition to electrical vehicles. Before the pandemic, one of the main issues was whether automakers could make enough profit to finance the huge investments necessary to launch a large number of new electrical models, and at the same time make enough profit to maintain the launch of traditional models, which hopefully would be the bread maker for the financing of the huge investments in the electrical vehicles and the complete value chain necessary for the electrical vehicles. Well, I think that one of the major impact of the pandemic is to make this issue much more difficult and much more complex than before, because if all the scenarios for the recovery made by the largest international institutions plus many influential national institutions are more or less right, which is that the recovery will last between 2 or 3 years. It means that we will not return to the normal, if we ever return to it, very soon. So only the companies, the automobile companies, which are able to make enough profit, or which have the backing of big banks, or which are able to raise money on the stock markets, will be able to maintain the investments in electrical vehicles and in the autonomous vehicles, in all this array of new technologies which needs a lot of investment. So I think that the largest ones, such as VW, Toyota, Honda, and others, like in Europe, Renault, have declared that they will maintain more or less the same investment plan that they had before, because they probably think that they will have enough money to do it. But smaller automakers will probably have to delay or even cancel their investment plan. So that will be something which I think will be the main consequence of the pandemic.
Okay.
I don't know if I've still sometimes, or if I've already used
no, I think
my 5 minutes.
We'll have subsequent questions. So if you can leave off for now, and we can switch to
sure.
William or Wang Hua.
I'm an obedient speaker. I stop there.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello? Okay. So I think that Bruno has made a very good summary, right? To further confirm, the first point is that the decline of the China automobile market started much earlier than the pandemic, right? To give you the figure, the total number of the sales in 2019 reached 25.8 million units. While this has already the result of a continuous decline of 8.2% year-on-year. That means compared to 2018. So when, secondly, interestingly, it is also find out that by April of this year, China stopped first time the continuous decline. It means that by April, it's stopped the 21 months consecutive decline. So this is a good sign, the first time. And then the sales continue to grow from April to May. So for the sales of May or this month, the year-on-year growth compared to the last year was 1.8%, with a total sales of, in 1 month, total sales of 1.61 million of passenger cars, or with a total of 2.2 million all the vehicle types. So this is to confirm Bruno's statement to say that the overall decline in the China market started much earlier. That means has been lasted for over 20 plus, right? Over 20 months. Then based on that, and then comes to the impact of the pandemic. And according to this shock, what we can see that there's the estimation that the overall sales of this year 2020, will be less than last year, right? Which means that we're less than 25.8 million units. So this is the second point. The third point I want to complement with what Bruno has mentioned is that China is not only focusing on the electric vehicles. Well, behind these electric vehicles, there are also significant investment in the field of smart vehicles. There are also lots of technologies being invested, both by international companies and the local companies. Even very recently, there was the strategic alliance between first AutoWorks, Dongfeng, and Chang'an on the creation of a new joint venture, Chinese joint venture, in the field of electrical components. They have already created also this type of strategic alliance in the field of business model innovation. That means the expansion towards the mobility solutions, right? In a concrete manner, the creation of a company called the T3, probably means top 3, right? And they have invested over 15,000 new energy vehicles put on the car sharing, car riding, market. And the fourth point I want to talk maybe also that is linking with tonight's topic. We can discuss a little bit later. That is the stimulation of the government policies. So we can probably discuss later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for keeping your comments within a time constraint. So we've had a combination of background and the specific impact of COVID, but let's return and spend a couple minutes each, since we ran slightly long in the first part, with things that are specific to COVID. Now, this will vary from each market. So when I've been part of conversations in the context of the United States, the value chain is what comes up first. And by that, I mean what's happening to used car prices. because used car prices affect the ability of replacement demand, the amount of money people receive when they turn in their old car. It affects the trade-off between sticking with your car, getting another used car, or going to the new market. And so there are a lot of feedback effects along the value chain. But for other markets, that's not necessarily the way in which the purchasing psychology works. And then there are the export markets. And we've also had a mix along the way of company specifics. So Volkswagen, we've not touched on the financial burdens that they have faced from their emissions scandal and the challenges that they might face in Europe, but they are the #1 selling manufacturer in terms of China through joint ventures. So that we've got this very complex mix of differing value chains, differing players, and the players who matter in one market may be affected much more by what happens in, say, profitability in the US than what's going on in their home market. That probably is the case of Honda. So let me go back to Stéphane and...
Anyway, let's just have a few minutes to talk that. So briefly, Tommaso asked, following the 2002, 2008 and 9 crisis, China and Asian markets provided most of the profitability for car makers. But perhaps this time that will not be the case. So the crisis will be worse or not. That's quite interesting because it's true, of course, following 2008 and 2009, the first driver was China, of course. But if you look well, also the European car markets, Western European car markets and the US car markets also, after a few years in 2012, 2013, had quite a huge expansion. On the contrary, Brazil and Russia faced several crises, economic crises, so very unstable conditions. So I think China alone cannot explain that. But for firms like Volkswagen, we know pretty well each that Volkswagen and GM, most of their profits come from China right now. So for them, and especially what happens now, what are the strategies right now? But the Chinese government relaxed a bit its policy, its joint venture policy recently. Yeah? We all know that for them it's a failure. The catch-up strategy didn't work well. So last year they relaxed these policies so that first Tesla could build a factory nearby Shanghai, but also Volkswagen jumped in so that to buy just 1 month ago, to buy major stakes into a battery maker and with another car maker. And we can perhaps think that this might be, contrary to what we thought 10 years ago, this might be the chance to have more electric car models that are affordable. Because another point, and I will finish with that, that might also restructure the automotive industry, because compared to US and European electric cars, in China, the cars are more affordable first, but also the weight of the cars is, let's say, better. So the emissions and so on are better in China. So perhaps we can think that the expansion of the NEV market and with new subsidies provided by the Ministry of Information and Technology might give better chances for those players to develop that market and find new solutions. That's one part of the answer. Sorry, I was a bit long.
Okay, Holger?
Well, I would like to concentrate again on Japan mainly. And so the immediate impact, as it's also shown on my slides, but you don't have to show the slides anyway, is that actually the downturn in the market here and in production here started only in April, so to say. So March was still here quite okay from in the domestic market, but April and May were very low, particularly low sales. But what we have to look at each time is that companies are doing quite well. So the performance of the companies is quite different here. And just to give an example, it depends, of course, also on the business model. But when, for instance, comparing Toyota and Mazda, I think there are some interesting points. That, for instance, in Japan, production at Mazda is down by 82%. So they are only producing 18% of the cars they produced last year at the same time. While at Toyota, for instance, they are still at 50% production. Also sales, for instance, Toyota, also Mazda in the home market is quite doing well, but there are companies like Nissan, like Mitsubishi, which are doing very badly right at the moment. With regard to what the duration of this crisis, I think Bruno said recovery will last for 2 to 3 years. So this would mean that the recovery would even last longer than the Lehman shock crisis. On the other hand, based on, for instance, press release 2 or 3 days ago, based on the forecast and market development, Mazda is or will run 2 shifts again in the beginning of July, and at the end of July, end of July in August, they try to have 60% to 80% of production of last year. So in this case, the crisis would be closer resembling what has happened after the earthquake in 2011 in March from the market.
Okay, I think we better move on to Bruno now.
Okay, thank you, Michael. The first thing I would like to say about the pandemic is that we still don't know when it will last, when it will stop, and how long it will last. We are still hoping that next year there will be a vaccine and that we will be better prepared to cure those who are sick. But we don't know if it will ever happen. Let's remind you that for AIDS, for instance, a vaccine was never found. And there are people who said that for this COVID-19, we may not find a vaccine anytime soon. So there are different scenarios, a lot of uncertainty. We don't know if it is a short-term impact and then return to normal, or if the world will have to live for the next years to come or forever with the COVID-19 and then with other viruses. There are serious people who are saying that this is just the beginning. So I don't want to be dramatic. Of course, I don't have any inside information about this, but I think that we should keep this in mind to build scenarios about what can be the future of the automobile industry after this pandemic. Maybe it will increase individualistic behavior that can be positive for the automobile market if people don't trust anymore collective transport and prefer to have their own private car to be safer. That's one possibility. If they can, because one of the short-term impact of the COVID is an impoverishment of many people all over the world, simply because production stopped and many people lost their jobs. And second, we don't know what will be the dominant trend of things, for instance, as the oil and gas market. To take just one example in Asia, I live in a country, a small country, Brunei, which is highly dependent on oil and gas. So it has no impact on the automobile market. But let's look at Indonesia, for instance, which is the largest country of Southeast Asia, it is also a huge producer of oil and gas, and it was considered as an emerging country for the automobile industry. Well, this market will probably strongly hit for several years, and it will delay the emergence of this market. And other countries that I don't have time to detail will be affected by the crisis in the same way. And then let's not forget that some countries have decided to launch huge recovery plans, but not all countries have the financial means to finance these recovery plans. And some are getting at their limit of indebtedness. I think in Latin America, we have the return of, we will face the return of a new debt crisis, which will limit the capacity of governments to intervene and try to relaunch the economy. Just one element, a positive element. In the case of China, for instance, the government has decided to inject 536 billion of US dollar in 7 different infrastructure projects, one of which is, for instance, a building electricity power station to ease the development of the electric vehicles. So those countries who have the capacity to do it will probably be the winner of the crisis, but there will be a lot of losers too.
Okay, thank you. William, Wang Hua.
Yeah, should I focus on the supply chain side? Or
you have the floor.
Yeah. Okay.
So as you wish.
Yes, I think that Bruno has presented a general perspective on the future possible evolution on China market, and I will complement by focusing on the what may be the future supply chain in China. I would like to talk about 4 points. The first point is that it is true that when you're talking about made in China, it is also made in global. Concretely, when I talk to the tier 1 supplier, the moment in the peak period of the pandemic in China, which means March, their forecast is the following, right? Because they need import components. Tier 1 supplier need import components outside China. So they said that we have, according to the current situation, we only have 4 months stock, right? If the pandemic continue to last, then we will have the short supply to our assembler. So this is a kind of a typical example to say that for certain kind of technology intensive components, China is still depending on the overseas market, first point. Second point, recently, I have also interviewed the president of Jetin, and during the interview, he said that even before the pandemic, by taking a look on the changing global geopolitical landscape, he has already anticipated a kind of a changing landscape in terms of the supply chain system. Indirectly, it means what he wants to say is that if certain countries want to make the decision in favor of their industry, both in terms of political reasons or kind of forced economic reasons, then for the Chinese OEM, they have to prepare the plan B, right? As we all know that in the supply system, you will have the A supplier and the B supplier. So they have to change the sequence of those suppliers. So this is the second situation. The third situation, when we dig deeper, and I think that is really a kind of a fundamental point, it deserves the deeper observation, is my assumption is the possible creation of two technology paradigms. One is driven by the US technology, and another one is a kind of reactive solutions that China create its own technology paradigm. Let's starting from the very big one. We are talking about competition between Beidou, satellite location system, it's called the Beidou, versus the GPS. Probably you don't know that China's version of GPS now has more satellites than US original, right? So this is a national competition for the security issues. Again, this is result forced by the America. In the very beginning, China want to use the GPS, and then it was a kind of decline. So after that, China decided to build its own GPS system called the Beidou. Second layer is talking about semiconductor products. We have already heard all the stories between Huawei and the US. And by taking a look on the semiconductor industry in China, what we can find that among the top 10, only one or even no are Chinese manufacturers. So in one day, if the American government further decide to close or put pressure on the automobile industry, again, China has to find alternative solutions for those chips linking with the controlling system of the car. So the third one is the 5G technology. So again, without talking into details, I close my third point, which means the possibility of creating two technology paradigm in the future, a global automobile industry. And the last point I want to talk is about in a positive, the silver line behind the clouds are the creation of a new supply chain system for the electric vehicles and smart cars in China. As you know, that China has already become the biggest in terms of the volume, the biggest producer, and also the car market for electric vehicles. And even you can see that, interesting enough, by the number of the sales, Tesla has become by sudden the #1 electric vehicles sold in China. So again, in the future landscape, it's not only a game by the Chinese, while the global players are all in. Another example is the joint venture, after Geely became the #1 shareholder of Daimler, be followed, the Beijing automobile company become the 3rd largest shareholder of Daimler, and then Geely launched the electric smart car manufacturing base in China. So again, what I see under the name of the hypothesis that China in the very soon future will become a global base for the production and industrial cluster for the smart and electric vehicles.
Okay, thank you. So we can move back to Stéphane and Holger and Bruno very briefly to look at, let's call it value chain issues and not just supply chain issues, because again, depending on the market, it may be used cars, it may be insurance, it may be government regulation that really comes to the fore rather than the tier 1 suppliers and their own suppliers. So before we launch in, we've already covered, at least in part, one of the questions, which is the impact of low oil prices. The question that we had was specific to the impact on electric vehicle markets because of the substitution between an ICE and an electric vehicle, the consumer proposition is in part due to the price of oil, at least in perception. Actually calculating out how much the cost of ownership varies with oil price may not be relevant, but consumers don't typically do such calculations. Another question that we have that we should address as we go along is mergers and acquisitions and potentially bankruptcies. So we have pending still the merger between the Fiat Chrysler and Peugeot PSA Group. We've had some acquisitions and consolidation inside China. Inside Japan, that consolidation is already largely complete in that Toyota has taken over gradually Daihatsu and has shareholdings in Mitsubishi and in Fuji Heavy Industries, Subaru, and others. So potential impact on mergers and acquisitions. Of course, that could extend to the supply chain, but the number of companies there is so large that it makes discussion complicated. And then finally, will this really bring to a close the faddish investments in autonomous vehicles as financial constraints begin to bite, and as we continue to have no examples of successful business models for monetizing autonomy, as opposed to adding consumer value for luxury vehicles. So let me switch to Stéphane.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I would like to link this question, well, 3 points mostly regarding the supply chain and related to the Asia development and the specificity of the Asian regionalization. Yeah, if we compare it with North America, NAFTA, which is not changed, Mercosur and EU, there is not a strong the establishment of a free trade zone or like that in Asia, taking also in account Asian. Yeah, there are several ways. Korea have several free trade agreements with Asian countries, with ASEAN also. And recently, at the end of 2019, signed an agreement with Indonesia, especially to have access to a specific supply of raw materials and so on. And we must keep in mind also that these value chains overall are quite linked to these political tensions in Asia. I mean, look, in 2016, 2017, there was a political tension between South Korea and China. What happened? Hyundai sales declined dropped 80%, yeah, within 1 year. If we look at all those histories, we see very, very strange political arrangements there. And of course, South Korea is following a very, very free trade approach, in my view. Yeah, well, so far they are not interested in investing in having FDIs in Asian countries and so on, and prefer to give the primacy to the export paradigm. So that is important. Japan, for more, as you know, as Holger pointed out, for more than now 25 years, the labor productivity is a huge issue in Japan. Yeah, overall, for more than 25 years, labor productivity is stagnating. I mean, also in the automotive industry overall. Yeah, which means that following the several crises they had, the labor-intensive activities were all delocalized to China or to Asian countries. For instance, wire harnesses or tool and die makers and so on, which means that the value chain in Japan, which was seen as for many years as one of the core strengths of Japan development with the developmental state and so on. Now we see several changes in Japan, and the lower tiers suppliers face many difficulties. Yeah. And they will face more and more difficulties, especially regarding the Chinese competition from lower tier suppliers who have quite same capabilities right now. So that is one issue that is quite important. And from the Chinese side, I would like to say that just William pointed out also that for the capital intensive production, they highly rely on imports. So that is another issue. This upgrading issue is still a question in most of the Chinese clusters of vehicles. And of course, the foreign ownership of most of the suppliers is also an issue that might be taken into account in China. Then my second point regarding autonomous vehicles and whether it might disrupt the automotive industry. The very history of autonomous vehicles development boomed, let's say, in the mid 2000s with several tests done in US by the US Army and many people from Stanford University, engineers, so on. And most of these engineers, you can find them in Waymo now, or in several other startups like that, yeah, for driverless cars. And what we can see is that the autonomous vehicles is an ongoing process of saying the future will be like that. But in fact, we do not see any outcome so far. How many announcements did we have in the last 10 years about the outcome of autonomous driving and so on, the 5 levels and all those things? I see that rather like, for me, it will not disrupt the industry because it follows exactly the automotive industry business model, which means to develop new technologies for the premium cars or the premium brands, and then just to adapt them for the lower segment cars. So the autonomous vehicles and so on only can bring new market value for some specific firms from the IT, and other things like that. That's my point.
Okay. Holger.
Well, if I could add something sad, not critical, but I would also to William, when looking, for instance, at technological development, particularly in the supply part industry, the Japanese are very strong after all. And so it was also pointed out that many of that in China, the most important suppliers are foreign supply part companies. And particularly still with regard to the electric vehicle, Japanese battery makers are quite ahead of the development as far as I can see. Which brings me to another point with regard to suppliers. Of course, Japan imports quite a lot of labor-intensive products from China. Nevertheless, as far as I see and also heard from representatives of, for instance, JAMA, many, they try to maintain at least a kind of independence from imports, which is also a necessity in the sense that we have here in Japan 9-10 million production capacity of vehicles, and this has to be filled up, and the Japanese government as well is trying to at least keep the industry here to some extent independent, also with regard to the political issues you have mentioned right now. With regard to autonomous vehicles, well, just judging from what is displayed at the auto shows, the Japanese manufacturers are at least looking in this direction. The point particularly here is that the infrastructure is not fit for that. That's well, quite obvious. And the third point, if I may say so, with regard what value chain, not just supply chain, well, first of all, like the used car market is not very important here in Japan. It's still, well, in comparison, used car market is very low with regard to, so the sales is very low with regard to new car sales. And just looking also at the import market, etc., and also the direction that companies here are going, I think still the old paradigm, the old pattern of upgrading, of going into the upper market segment is still very common here. I don't know whether I could answer some of the questions you raised, but I think these are the observations in addition to what Stéphane has said.
Okay, Bruno, if you can unmute yourself. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Talking about the impact of the pandemic and the crisis on the supply chain, first, I would like to say that the immediate impact is that the countries which are able to control the pandemic and restart their production are the ones that will win on the long term because they will establish the necessary confidence of the largest automobile companies that they are reliable countries where you can maintain a supply chain. And the countries which won't be able to control the pandemic will probably lose part of their industrial base because they increase their risk of disruption for the big players. The second element is that the pandemic has created obstacles to labor mobility. And you can clearly see it in Asia, for instance, in the north of Vietnam, where Chinese companies, but also companies from other countries have invested a lot of money in part makers. Then the lockdown has completely blocked the necessary movement of qualified workers or semi-qualified workers or non-qualified workers. So all levels of skills are involved. And this creates huge difficulties for the daily operations of companies throughout the region. So this has to be resolved in one way or another. But again, it depends on the how long the epidemic will last, and if one day it will stop for good. Now, I would like to take a more holistic view of the supply chain, and I would like to talk about aspects that have not been covered so far. And if I refer to the electric car, you know that to have electric cars, you need batteries, and batteries need a lot of natural resources, which are not found in all countries of the world. Let me do 1 second of personal marketing. I have just finished an article about this that will be published soon by the International Journal of Automobile and Technology, headed by Giuseppe, that precisely talks about the long-term investments of car makers in the mining companies to secure the necessary supply of natural resources that are necessary to produce batteries. For instance, to give you an example, Tesla, its subsidiary in China, has just arranged a contract with Glencore, which is one of the largest mining companies that produce lithium or cobalt or other critical minerals, for the supply of its giga plant in China to equip the Teslas that are produced in China. Why is it possible? Because Tesla in China has found the financial backing of Chinese banks. So this is an example of companies who have enough power and financial power to secure long-term supplies and be probably in good position when the pandemic will be over. I would like to take a second example, Volkswagen, which has decided to maintain its long-term investment in the electric car, probably because in Germany and in Europe, the authorities have decided to maintain the same policy as before the pandemic. Well, in China, Volkswagen has just bought the parent company of JAC, and also to secure once again its long-term supply of critical metals by buying a local Chinese battery makers. So again, these are examples of how the companies that have enough money are using the pandemic to buy some part makers or mineral providers at a rather.
Okay, again, I continue the discussion after Bruno. To continue the discussion in the field of electric vehicles, I would like to provide several figures to say that from a global value chain perspective, China will represent, I think, if the situation continue like that, will take half of the hybrid and the new energy vehicles. Why? The statistic of 2019 is the following. Globally, the sales volume was 2.2 million units. Well, in China, China sold 1.2 million units, which means 54.5% of the new energy cars are sold in China. So this is at the car level. Then at the battery level, there are two statistics is also important, right? China is the #1 in terms of the production of the battery for the cars. The battery represent 30% or sometimes even higher to 40% of the total car value. And because of this manufacturing base in China, in the last 10 years, the price of the battery has been decreased by 87%. So without talking about the raw materials part, China has certain kind of the reserve, right? And for the battery business in China, named Didi, has also a big market value, and according to different estimations, it can be at the half size at least of Uber's value, which was 25.6 billion US dollars. So the mobility services part is also a big piece of the cake that Chinese car makers together with international players want to acquire. Again, because recently I studied the case of the Jetin, so you can see that one is the premium car business in the China market after the kind of the failure of the Car2Go project in China. The third point of the value chain is linking with the digitalization. At like Chang'an or Shanghai automotive industries, they are, even during this period of pandemic, for example, China of L4, right? L4 is a higher level of autonomous drive. And SAIC, Shanghai Automobile Group, they recently established a kind of software center, and they plan to recruit 1,100 staff in about 3 years to reinforce this software development team, among the other examples. So I do find, I do see that in terms of new energy vehicles, mobility solutions, digital transformations, those are the important piece that illustrate the dynamics of the China market, China automobile market, and eventually how the change of, or how the development of the China automobile market will shift the landscape in certain segments.
Okay, I think we run until 9:30, or are we scheduled to run until 10? But Stéphane, you can pitch in with that. But two general questions that have come up. One is, we really haven't talked much about the impact on employment. Now, we have to remember Bruno's caution that at this point it's really speculation, given the uncertainties of how the COVID-19 will evolve. Since I'm sitting in the US 3.5 months into self-lockdown with grandchildren living with me, this looks very different from what's going on in certain other countries. And this also has lots of implications. The US political economy is bizarre. So that puts challenges on everyone in thinking what the impact will be on employment. And then one other question that can feed into what William just spoke about is anyone actually making money in the electric vehicle segment other than perhaps battery manufacturers such as CATL and BYD, and in the United States, A123, which is actually owned by a Chinese company, and then LG and Samsung, and SK, the Korean battery manufacturers. So as I look at it, I see the tier ones making money on electric vehicles, but I see the OEMs losing money hand over fist, and that includes Tesla, which, if we subtract subsidies, has never come close to making money in its 13-year history, despite making and selling vehicles that are priced as luxury vehicles. So let's begin briefly, and I'll let the participants pitch in rather than try to go through each of us because we have limited time. So first, any thoughts on the impact on labor market? Of course, the short run is something that is speculative, but longer run impacts on, for example, realignment of value chains. And we've had a bit of that with the discussion of trends in Japanese population and labor force already. And on similar demographics in China. The population isn't falling in China yet, but by 2030 it will be. And migration from the countryside to cities has essentially stopped. And that's really been the source of labor force growth inside China. So we've got some labor force trends going on in different places. And then questions about whether, let's avoid the Didi and Uber and the like, which to my knowledge all lose money. And focus instead on electric vehicles, which is where Europe is placing very large bets. maybe William, if you want to lead off, since you've been playing last, let's let you be first this time.
Which part? You know, in terms of the labor topic, I'm not the expert in this field. While I do see that there is a kind of ongoing, you know, industrial reconfiguration, right, for the small players. It's really at the stage of the bankruptcy, right? There is certain kind of, you know, much smaller player than, you know, Chinese private companies. They are in this type of situation. So kind of the industrial reconfiguration is something we can see, right? If the pandemic or the second wave or even the third wave come back, small players will become much fragile. Some of them will definitely go bankruptcy. And another side of the hidden part of the fact is that even when we're talking about the private companies, and they are kind of de facto supported by the local or regional governments, right, for the stability of the employment. So the government will also provide a certain kind of support in different forms, try to stabilize the local employment market and the social stable situation. So there is a mixed picture. Secondly, talking about electric vehicles, it is true that you know, making electric vehicles are not necessarily making money. And the interesting phenomenon, at least in the past, what you can find that I can say that in a safe way to say over 50% of the electric vehicles sold are not to the private consumers, right? Are to the you know, the car sharing, car renting companies. So this is the situation in China. And again, let's put in a nuanced way. When we're talking about electric car in China, the topic about low-speed electric cars are not put on the table, right? So here I would like to say that if you say traditional electric vehicles are not making money, well, don't forget that another hidden part of the China automobile market is that China has sold more than 1 million low-speed electric vehicles into tier 3, tier 4, tier 5 smaller cities. And for those type of cars, there's no subvention incentives from the government. And on the contrary, you know, central government put lots of pressures to try to, you know, stop the development of that segment. So for that market is a grassroots way of growth, and they are making money because the structure of the product is simpler, and those are, you know, low-income Chinese are buying that. So again, in China, it's more complex, but for the complex situation in a simplified way, electric vehicles like Tesla not making money, while low-speed electric vehicles with a price of 4,000 euros or $4,000 or a little bit more, they are making money and have sold over 1 million units per year.
Okay, that's very helpful. Again, the heterogeneity of markets in the United States, it's impossible to convince people to buy small cars of any sort. So Ford is stopping making sedans in North America, or at least in the United States market, Canadian market. So we've got a lot of variation there, and it's important to remember that China is a huge market, and it is not the same as the markets in the US or USMCA, nor is it the same as markets in Europe. Okay, Bruno, you're unmuted, so jump in.
Thank you. Yes, you raised many questions, so I will try to address at least some of them briefly. Regarding labor, I am pessimistic. If I have in mind the fact that the recovery will not happen soon and that the recovery will be slow, it means that a lot of pressure will be put on cost and on labor cost again. And we know how traditionally companies address the issue of cost. They downsize, they delocalize, they try to increase the rate of automatization. So Tommaso raised in one of his questions the trend for robotization. I think that with the brand new technologies that are coming, not only the new generation of robots by the new smart companies and what is called the industrial revolution 4.0, there will be a tendency to replace human labor by new technologies in order to reduce cost as much as possible. That will be, I would say, the general trend. So in countries like Germany or to some extent France, where there is still social rules and constraints, where workers can still receive some forms of allowance, the impact will be less than in countries where all these social institutions don't exist, and workers, when they lose their employment, they lose everything at the same time. And this is probably the majority of the countries in the world. So I'm rather pessimistic. Regarding your other question about the cost of electric cars and the capacity of companies to make money, there is a debate regarding the interplay between economies of scale, the future economies of scale in the production of batteries, which makes 50% of the cost of an electric car. And I think that, at least that's what I thought before the pandemic, that we were entering the mass marketing of electric cars and for that reason, the mass marketing of batteries. And for that reason, economies of scale would start to reduce drastically the cost of batteries to the point that car makers could start to make a profit. So that was the scenario. But the opposite trend that I developed in my article is that there is not enough reserves of minerals, of raw material supplies, and in particular cobalt, but even nickel or manganese. And many people think that, at least on the short term, there will be a huge increase of the price of these minerals, which enter in the production of batteries, that will counteract the reduction of cost of batteries due to economies of scale, and something that it can be to the point to make batteries ever more expensive when the mass marketing of the electric car will start. But then let's not forget technical progress.
Looks like we lost him altogether. So we have scheduled this to run until 9:30, but there's no reason that we can't keep running a bit past the time limit. So let me wrap up here in terms of the formal part, and then we can continue addressing questions on an informal basis until such time as most of us feel we need to move on. So we can run another 15 minutes beyond the scheduled time, and we can allow other individuals to speak briefly. So perhaps Tommaso, as the core individual within Gerpisa, if you want to add something at this point, please do so.
I've raised some questions in the chat, so I'm just curious about, there were a couple of points that were not really covered. We see in Europe that there's been aids that has been given by the state to the employers to keep people on jobs. I've seen the economists talking about zombies jobs, suggesting that these jobs are already dead and they're just kept alive and they will eventually die, but nevertheless that reduces the economic impact of the crisis. I was wondering what is happening in Asia, in particular in China. Is there political tools to support jobs and keep the people employed, or in particular concerning the huge mass of temporary workers and migrant workers which are used in the industry have been all laid off during the crisis? What would be the social and political impact if that is the case, in particular in the lower level of the value chain? We have seen some major strikes taking place in some areas of China after the crisis. So is there some danger of social tensions due to that, or the state is covering up? So that would be my first question, and concerns mainly China. But I guess the problem must arise as well in Japan, even if we have already discussed about the fact that there are less and less young people working in the industry, so perhaps it's a less acute problem in Japan than it is in China. And the second question concerns the electric cars. There have been many questions in the chat about is the rescue packaging, or what the state is coming up in terms of solution to start again the industry, involving an acceleration towards electrification? Are the aids of supports given to the industry focusing on increasing the number of new electric vehicles, new energy vehicles, or electric cars in Japan? And so if you can talk a little bit about that.
Okay, and before we launch into this, just a reminder for people who really do need to leave at the end of the scheduled time. This is the first of several panels that Gerpisa is organizing. So there will be a panel focused on North America tomorrow. And I don't remember the exact schedule, but Tommaso, there are 2 additional ones later on.
It will be Europe after tomorrow, and on Friday we will have emerging countries. Basically, that will be on Brazil and India and Mexico. That will be the 3 main countries that will be discussed on Friday.
Okay, so if you are not on the email list or otherwise, you can go to the Gerpisa website at gerpisa.org to get details of those. Node 6100, if I recall correctly, having looked many times. Okay, let's turn then to Tommaso's questions. If someone has specific knowledge of Korea, that might actually be an important example to start with, because Korea has a very vocal labor movement, and because of their interactions with the markets in China and in the United States, the Korean car companies and suppliers such as Hyundai Mobius have been particularly hard hit in the short run. So if someone follows Korea, it would be good to have some words there. Otherwise, and we don't need to limit to the official speakers. So if someone has knowledge on the labor issues and wants to speak to this, please unmute yourself and ask to have the floor.
Okay, may I few words about Korea? From what I know and what I've seen, the government provided several subsidies, yeah, like loans with low interest rates and so on, to support mainly 3 main key industries. The automotive industry is one of them. And from at the very early stage of the pandemic in Korea, early February, talks began. And of course, as you told Mike, there the labor unions are very strong. It's offset that Hyundai, for 1 month, they don't work in the Hyundai factories due to labor movements, due to labor activism, and so on. So for 2 months, there were strong discussions with the government, and they provided this economic package. But one of the trade-off was always employment, secure employment, just like Tommaso pointed out in Europe. Same things happened in Korea. And they said I thought in April 22, the Korean New Deal, something like that, was enacted. And the government provided many subsidies. Mainly, it's like a cascade-like thing, just like in Japan, first to the large firms, and then they are supposed to help the smallest firms, but with the condition that they secure and even create 500,000 jobs in the coming 5 years, which for me appears quite impossible, yeah, just regarding the economic situation of Korea, which is very, very, as you told Mike, dependent on the Chinese and the US markets, yeah. For Japan, just let me add, it's quite important. We all know well the labor unionism in Japan was very strong in the 1960s, 1970s. And what happened very recently is that the overall labor, the workforce in Japan changed dramatically after the 1990s. Now, roughly 40% of the workers in Japan are non-permanent workers, several different kinds of jobs, yeah? That is quite impressive when we think about lifetime employment and all those things. And this dual labor market is very problematic for Japan, and I'm quite sure that this corona pandemic will have strong impacts on those people. And we'll call many people, and especially young men in their 20s, 30s, and even in their 40s, no longer want to marry. They prefer to have non-permanent jobs even than to work for one firm all their life long. And then this became a big issue in Japan, and it will worsen their conditions in the coming years. So, and the second specificity of Japan is that, perhaps you've all heard about that, but the internal labor markets, the labor markets in the firms, are very strong in Japan. It means that the firms you acquire are firm-specific skills in Japan, and this is still the case nowadays. Yeah, the mobility in the labor force is very low in Japan, which means it's hard for people to move from one firm to the other once they have a full-time employment job. And this very rigid labor market needs to be, I think the government still doesn't take that issue into account in Japan, yeah, or doesn't consider it like a very important issue. But I think reforms should be done here. And last point when we finish here, corporate governance also in Japan, just like in Korea, we've had plenty of problems in 2016-17 with corruption between political elites and economic elites in Korea, especially Samsung. In Japan, corporate governance, a new law was enacted in 2014 so that there are more diversity. Cross-shareholdings did fail in Japan, but still people of the board of directors are still the same elite people, and they reproduce their attitudes, the same things, which explains most of the problems seen in Mitsubishi, also Nissan, and other firms like that. So there are several things linked with the labor market which should be reformed, but still I'm quite pessimistic regarding these evolutions.
Would someone else like to pitch in?
Well, may I add maybe something to Stéphane's thing? Well, first of all, when looking at the elite or is it okay? Can you hear me?
Yes.
When you're looking at the elite right now in the companies, they are something like 50 plus, close to 60. So they come still out of the old Japan. That's the one point. And also the labor market was never as rigid as it was perceived to be. I would also point to the fact, and I'm not so pessimistic, Of course, the lower you go, the more the pressure is on the people. That's everywhere the same. But when compared, for instance, to the Lehman crisis, where we had quite a lot of labor problems, so that the foreign workers, mainly from Brazil, were thrown out of the companies and gathered then in parks in Tokyo. Still at the moment, this problem well, seems to be under control, and I think that also the state is not really like in Europe, like in Germany, like in France, giving subsidies to workers, but the companies try to maintain at least their core employment. And so far, other than, for instance, in China and in Korea, we have not any kind of intervention from side the government so far. I just read the other day that the Japanese car maker association, the supply part association, the Shata, so the body association, together with an association which is called the Japanese manufacturer of tools and machinery for the automobile industry. They came together and decided to use their savings and their access to the financial markets in order to give money to companies which are in danger to go bankrupt. So the initiative seems to come from another side here. So I'm not that pessimistic here with regard to Japan. And also, well, I talked about the demographic changes, etc. I'm not so sure that we will have this kind of dramatic changes due to the COVID crisis.
Need to unmute myself. Would someone else among our general listeners have some points that they would like to add?
Maybe I have one point. So I'm a bit, I don't know, maybe Holger and Stéphane have different point of view, but regarding the general population development and the need to hire young people, what I see just from our universities that the companies are very conservative in hiring people in comparison to the last few years. So that's a bit like becoming more complicated again, like it was maybe 10, 15 years ago. So I don't know if maybe that's just in Kyushu, but that's like a thing that I don't see that there's like a huge need to hire people in Japan at the moment, because then they would hire people from universities.
Okay, yes, so overall economic growth in Japan is very close to zero and has been, and that certainly interacts with the labor market, with the willingness of companies to hire looking forward. It looks like we have reached a natural point to wrap things up,
Yeah,
unless Tommaso wants.
May I just ask a question? Sometimes you
Sure.
have the right, yes? 10 years ago, there was big strikes in the Guangdong region, starting at the Honda factory, then a snowball effect to many suppliers here. And so I would like just to ask some people, perhaps William or people who know better the Chinese labor market, what was the impact on the employment relations 10 years later? And what do you think, especially about those migrant workers? Might they have greater rights right now or not? And what will be the impact? Do you see any change following these big strikes? William, do you have anything, or anybody else who knows well the Chinese labor market?
Sorry, I'm not the specialist in the labor market things. So despite I'm in China, I did not pay too much attention on that aspect. So I prefer to leave the floor to some other experts.
Well, I'm not an expert, but we've been cooperating with Boy Lutke, who is based in that region as a chair from the Volkswagen chair with the Chinese university, and has been working on this topic together with his students. He has published quite a lot about that, also in our iJatman special numbers. So I think you can find on the Gerpisa sites the article and you can access that. And he told us that there have been changes, institutional changes, and that social dialogue has been institutionalized, elections have been established so that workers can elect their own representatives. And this has spread at the regional level, but has remained at the regional level. It's not spilled over towards other regions in China. So it remains an exceptional development, but that shows that there is a potential for a transformation of labor institution in China, and that central government, I mean, it's unclear what the central government is thinking about these developments, because clearly from one side, this is a welcome development because it might help to raise basic wages and therefore increase the potential for China for internal growth rather than depending on export, and so rebalancing the economy with a huge potential, because China remains one of the most populated country in the world, and there is a lot of economic disparity. So bringing more people into the modern economy, that would be an advantage. But at the same time, it's still the home to the world factory, and cost is a factor. So how do you balance the risk of raising labor costs and at the same time keeping all the investment coming and keeping the competitiveness? So there's been positive development in that area, but has no actual spillover in terms of institutional change in other areas in China, as far as understood. I'm just referring to the work of Boy because I'm not an expert at all myself on this topic.
Yes, and unfortunately, he's not part of the audience as far as I can tell. Would anyone else like to add?
Yeah, I just would like to answer a few questions which is asked in the chat. So actually about the, someone asked about the policy on the EV in China, because I have been following this trend. So recently in April, the government has kind of prolonged the subsidy. So other than finish at the end of this year, there will be at least by 2022, and it will be cutting very gradually each year, like 10% first year, 20% and 30% for the third year. So actually, I think it's a very needed support from the government for the EV industry, which is also very impacted after the COVID. And also about the question about if the policies are technologically selective. Actually, since I think 2012 or 13, all the policies regarding subsidies in China about EV, they are all organized in a way there is a basic level. So if you reach the performance required, for example, driving range, for example, emission standard, you can get a basic subsidy level. And if your performance is higher, there are different degrees of multipliers, let's say. So you can get better, you can get higher subsidy. So I think it's very evident way of pushing the evolution technologically towards a better performance. Then I don't know about the previous question about the employment. I'm not expertise in this field, but I know that there are a lot of measures, especially regarding the taxes reduction for companies, for small companies, a little bit of redemption to workers, but it's not very active yet. And we know also in the case of China, and since mid-March, the activity is already returning back quite fast. So I think the government is kind of depending on the market to recover slowly. At the same time, I remember also there are some policies trying to promote in the public sector the sales of EV. We know the buses and all the kind of shuttle bus which is used, and it will be, I think, like for next year, since next year, all the public purchase in several cities, they will be only in the electric vehicle. So no more traditional vehicles, especially in the public purchase. So there are a lot of policy which is pushing the mobility to getting green, which also confirms China's ambition to lower the carbon emission. Yeah, that's what I want to share. Okay.
Okay. Well, it's a useful reminder that while we have national policies, there are also subnational policies, city-specific policies. If we move to the United States, California is different from and the states that follow California have their own set of policy rules, so they're under political attack at the moment. And Europe has quite a bit of variation from country to country. So, well, I think we have reached the end of our time, unless someone has a burning question or a particular statement that they'd like to raise. We've covered some of the long-run trends, the attempt to put COVID into that context, the need to be very cautious because we don't know whether COVID is something that will resolve quickly, or as is happening in China with regional lockdowns on a sporadic basis, whether that will be the new normal for a year or 2 years, whether there will ever be a vaccine. And so we have to be very careful in speculating there. And then with technology trends and supply chain trends, some of those longer run forces seem to be continuing. Certainly the regionalization is something that I will probably address very briefly tomorrow, in that despite the many disruptions around the world, the supply chain disruptions in my observation have been remarkably limited. So the initial impact in China did not carry over in a large measure to Europe and the United States. Again, the timing of the impact of the pandemic makes it very hard to be sure how true that is. William noted the 4 months worth of inventory, and that can cover up a lot of the fragility that may become apparent this fall or later this summer. So I think we can wrap up what we've done today. We've not had, that I know of, any industry participants, so we can't lean upon people, though typically industry participants have to be very guarded in what they say. And tune in later this week for additional Gerpisa roundtables, and go to the website and see the presentations and papers that are available there. I have not, and when I last looked, no one else had yet put up comments and discussion, but hopefully that will be following over the next week. I have a set prepared, but again, not yet up there. And there are lots of other seminars going on. Many of the consulting companies have turned their seminars from very costly seminars to ones that are either low cost or freely available. So if you, like I, am forced to work from home, then there are certainly many opportunities to stay connected and stay informed. So thank you all for joining. We still have 24 people at the end of almost 2 hours. So we all appreciate your patience, and let's give a round of virtual applause to the 4 speakers today.